The day is February 22nd, 2022. Witch Queen is just released as the latest expansion of Destiny 2, and most importantly, Void 3.0 has begun to set the standard for all subclasses going forward. There's a new big bad to chase after, as well as new exotics to chase after. Here are the 10 most broken exotic weapons from 2022. This list is going to be roughly in chronological order. There will be some overlap as some weapons have continued to stay somewhat prominent, but we're going to be looking where weapons kind of peaked in infamy in the Crucible, at least in the collective consciousness of Destiny 2 players. We're not going to be focusing on any weapons that were already pretty good or have always kind of lingered in the meta. Things like Jotun, Witherhoard, and Ace of Spades have always been pretty solid, so we're going to ignore some of those. Let's start with DMT. Yes, we are in a DMT meta right now, but back in the day, DMT was an absolute powerhouse. If you weren't using DMT, you were getting killed by DMT. 150 RPM from the hip, with the ability to, for free, stack damage just by simply landing headshot hits. Once you reached Cranial Spike times 5, you are capable of 2 Sharding Guardians. DMT was a monster, and this was before airborne effectiveness, this was before a full auto mod, this was before flinch changes, this is before everything. This was sort of the standard of the meta going forward as this more defensive orientated with high burst damage. DMT has had its ups and downs. After that bit of time when it had that 150 RPM from the hip and being very dominant in the Crucible, it got borderline slaughtered to the point of not really being usable at all, to where it is now of having a 130 RPM hip fire with a much more generous and much more forgiving headshot hitbox. Coming up next was Chappie. This is before shotgun changes, and Chaperone was the king of all shotguns. The Chaperone had a ridiculous amount of range with good accuracy and the ability to get even more damage and accuracy if you did proc its Roadborne perk. Today, Chaperone is still a very good weapon in the meta, but it's not nearly as strong as it used to be, as airborne effectiveness and the lack of being able to stack into it with the Chappie, and a general nerf to overall shotguns brought the Chaperone down from its pedestal. But it was soon to be replaced by a weapon that would last through many metas, the Lorenz Driver. The Lorenz Driver, on release, was nutty. It had the ability when its perk was proc to one-shot body shot guardians, as well as any damage bonus given to it was capable of giving it this one-shot as well. This is before things like Charge of Light and Powering Rifts only did 15% bonus damage. Back in the day, it was a solid 20, allowing this thing to very easily rack up kills. Not only that, but also on release, it also would mark targets through walls who were targeted by a Lagrangian sight. Once its body shot damage was finally tuned down, as well as the damage bonuses from things like Empowering Rift, Lorelei Splendor, and Charges of Light were brought down to a 15%, it still had the best flinch game in the game, able to blast people's heads off even if they were standing in a proverbial lead storm. This weapon lasted through many other weapons we're going to mention on this list, but this was definitely at its peak when it was absolutely certifiably broken. Following short after was a brief stint of the Last Word getting a bit of a buff. This is coming a little bit on the heels of 180 hand cannons and 180 scout rifles getting a buff. Under the hood, the Last Word is actually a 180 hand cannon, and the Last Word received a small damage bonus as a participation trophy. The Last Word is dealing a little bit more headshot damage than it should be, and it's during this time that Solar 3.0 was out, so the ability to get Radiance was also available, allowing the Last Word to hit from ranges very consistently, very quickly, that it should probably never realistically be hitting. The Last Word was eventually adjusted so that it did not deal the extra bonus damage. However, it is still a very solid weapon to this day, and arguably could be in that other list of Jotun, Ace of Spades, and Witherhoard, as it's never really truly fallen out of the meta, as is the Last Word style. Lord of Wolves has always been an infamous weapon in the Crucible, and whenever it does show up, it tends to dominate the Crucible. This was a very short stint of time when the Lord of Wolves was the meta, just simply because it was the best compared to everything else. Lord of Wolves had more range, it had 15 in the magazine, which was 3 shots, and even though Release the Wolves in Crucible was still kinda trash, the weapon by itself with Solar 3.0 allowed it to be a staple of a lot of players' builds. Lord of Wolves has been toned down since then, changing it so that it only has 2 shots when it spawns in, and a really significant nerf in its overall range and lethality. Lord of Wolves is still alright, but when you have the ability to instantly kill something with a shotgun, as well as shotguns generally being much better now, Lord of Wolves doesn't feel nearly as strong. Coming up next, and arguably still in the meta to this day, is the No Time to Explain. Pulse rifles had recently gotten a rework to allowing it to be a little bit more consistent, and the .67 TTK of high impact pulses was felt extremely well by the No Time to Explain. This weapon has received very little changes as the archetype by itself has been the primary focus, but back then a faster TTK with the weapon's little side portal buddy made this weapon a staple in a lot of players' builds just simply because of its availability and lethality. Jade Rabbit has never really had a place in the meta until this year. Jade Rabbit had a very brief moment of time where, with changes that came to 150 RPM scout rifles, the Jade Rabbit was the top dog. The meta continued to push for a more team shot and long range orientated playstyle, and the Jade Rabbit was king with a 0.8 second TTK at basically any range in the game. Unfortunately, the inconsistency in the exotic perk meant that you were never really able to take advantage of what it made it exotic, other than the fact that it was a stat monster. Jade Rabbit has recently received a bit of a change and unfortunately has been disabled, so just pretend that the gameplay you're seeing here is Jade Rabbit. Following Jade Rabbit was another strange weapon that you hardly ever see talked about except in hushed whispers among cult circles, and that's the Fighting Lion. For a brief period of time, the Fighting Lion became the king of dealing out large portions of damage, particularly what you would see as multiple people on the same team running the Fighting Lion and just spamming damage down a lane just to prevent people from getting onto zones or just simply supplying area denial. The Fighting Lion didn't necessarily get any major changes that made it this way, it just sort of found itself there with the special ammo changes and the rest of the sandbox sort of giving it a prime opportunity to show its stuff. About around this time, we were also introduced to Airborne Effectiveness, one of the most massive and sweeping changes to ever hit the Crucible sandbox. Airborne Effectiveness became the hot topic of discussion for almost every PvP circle, and no weapon was better at exploiting airborne effectiveness than the Dead Messenger. Waveframe grenade launchers as a whole were very good simply because they made Guardians jump into the air, which of course made them deal with airborne effectiveness's inconsistency and, a generally quick cleanup from the person firing from the ground. But Dead Messenger was special purely because of the consistency that this weapon could push out. This was also around the time we got Arc 3.0, and a little melee called the Lightning Surge melee allowed for a near guaranteed team wipe on a close-knit team using a Dead Messenger followed immediately with that Lightning Surge melee for a whopping 230 plus damage. Dead Messenger still has a place in the meta to this day, but as airborne effectiveness continues to be slightly brought down by Bungie, I think you'll slowly start to see this thing fade. And lastly, the Telesto. Towards the end of Season of Plunder, Telesto became sort of a mini community event. Besides the fact that Telesto became Paul Tassie's copium, the Telesto was an absolutely busted weapon in literally every sense. The gun sort of took over Twitter, it took over Destiny, it took over Destiny's announcement screens. It was a bit of fun, but the real kicker was that when the gun was in its prime state, it transformed into an infinitely ranged explosive fusion rifle with the ability to easily clean up multiple Guardians with just one shot. Telesto during this time was the king of all engagements. Thankfully, this meta didn't last very long as this was obviously Bungie's attempt at having a little bit of fun with the game, so this quickly was patched out. But during the time that it was, can you imagine the frustration of getting killed by Telesto from clear across the map and having it kill the rest of your team as well? And to wrap this list off, we're going to talk about a few honorable mentions, things that realistically could be on this list, but 10 is a lot better than 13 from a number standpoint looking at the video's title. Vexmouth the class at the start of the very early start of this year had a really high usage rate, which ended up getting toned down eventually just for its damage and the ability that it could just switch into linear fusion mode whenever it got 3 kills, which is very strong. The Forerunner, which is very dominant to this day, but it never really had as much of a pop as some of the other weapons did, but I could absolutely see an argument for this being replaced on any one of these positions on this list. And lastly, the Arbalist. I didn't put Arbalist on this list just because it's kind of like Lorenz Driver, but less. It did have a different time when it was available, but this is this year alone, which Lorenz Driver definitely dominated over its older brother. I'm curious as to what your most and least favorite meta of 2022 was, and let me know if there's any weapons I might have missed. If you enjoyed this series, we might do it again next week for PvE. Bless your faces, and deuces.